1. The quiet beginning. The most painful loneliness is feeling alone while someone is still right beside you. There was no explosion. No shouting. No moment you could point to and say, "This is where it broke." It began quietly. He was there. Every day. In the same room. On the same bed. Sometimes even holding her hand. And yet, something essential was missing. She couldn't explain it at first. Because nothing looked wrong. They ate together. They talked about schedules, errands, weekend plans. They laughed at the right moments. From the outside, it looked like love. But inside her, there was a silence that kept growing. She noticed it in the smallest moments. When she shared something that mattered. And his response arrived late. Shallow, distracted. When her words landed, but never stayed. She began telling herself stories. He's tired. He's stressed. This is what adulthood looks like. And maybe that's what hurt the most. How reasonable the loneliness seemed. Before we continue, if stories about quiet abandonment, emotional distance, and the kind of grief no one talks about resonate with you, subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast. This is a space for the truths we whisper, not shout. She didn't feel abandoned. Not yet. She just felt unseen. Like a presence without warmth. Like a conversation without listening. Like love, stripped of its emotional gravity. She stopped bringing things up. Not because they didn't matter. But because explaining herself started to feel heavier than staying silent. And that's how it begins. Not with loss. But with the slow disappearance of being felt. This was the quiet beginning. The part no one warns you about. The moment when love doesn't end. It simply stops reaching you. 2. When presence isn't care. He was still there. That was the confusing part. Not missing, not gone, not out of your life. Just not with you. He'd sit across from her at dinner, scrolling, nodding at the right times. He'd ask, "You good?" the way people ask about weather, like the answer doesn't change anything. And Lila learned how to respond in a way that kept the room calm. "Yeah, I'm fine." Soft voice, small smile, no trouble. Because she could feel it, the invisible rule. If she made it emotional, he'd retreat. If she needed too much, he'd become colder. If she cried, he'd freeze, then offer solutions like bandages, never comfort like warmth. So she started editing herself. She stopped saying, "I miss you," because he'd say, "I'm right here." She stopped saying, "I feel lonely," because he'd say, "That's not true." And every time he said those things, he believed them. That's what hurt, how innocent his distance looked from his side of the room. Presence became his proof. A body in the house. A text reply. A ride home. A shared bed. But care wasn't logistics. Care was noticing the tremble in her voice. Care was asking the second question. Care was staying when the conversation got quiet. Instead of filling it with a TV show, a phone screen, a quick kiss that ended too soon. There were moments she tried. Little, careful attempts. She'd say, "I had a rough day," and he'd reply, "What happened?" But his eyes wouldn't lift. His tone wouldn't open. And when she paused, hoping he'd come closer, he'd take the pause as an ending. "Okay, well, you'll be fine." And maybe she would. But she didn't want to be fine. She wanted to be held. Not physically. Emotionally. To be someone's priority, not someone's background. She began to notice the difference between being touched and being met. He could wrap an arm around her waist while his mind stayed miles away. He could say, "Love you," like a habit, without looking at the part of her that was quietly breaking. It's a strange kind of grief. Watching someone stay. And still losing them, piece by piece. Because you can't point to a door closing. You can't prove abandonment when the person never leaves. You just feel it in the way your stories get shorter. In the way your laughter becomes polite. In the way you stop sharing good news, because it lands like paper. Not like light. And eventually, Lila realized something that changed her breathing. He wasn't trying to hurt her. He just didn't know how to care in the places she needed. And that meant she had a choice she wasn't ready to name: keep asking for water from a well that didn't know it was dry, or stop calling thirst too much. 3. The first disappointment she didn't name. The first disappointment didn't arrive loudly. It didn't announce itself. It didn't even feel like disappointment at all. It felt small, easy to dismiss, too subtle to confront. It showed up the day she shared something fragile. A fear she hadn't rehearsed. A hope she hadn't made safe. She told him carefully, watching his face the way you watch water for ripples. And he listened. At least, that's what it looked like. He nodded. He said the right words. But his attention drifted. Just enough for her to notice. The moment passed. And nothing followed. No checking back later. No quiet, "Are you okay now?" No sense that her vulnerability had landed somewhere real. She told herself it was nothing. Everyone misses moments. Everyone gets distracted. So she folded the feeling down until it fit somewhere unimportant. But something changed after that. She became more selective. More careful. She started editing not just her words, but her needs. When she felt a wave of sadness coming, she swallowed it. When excitement rose, she measured it. When disappointment appeared again, she labeled it something safer. I'm tired. I'm sensitive. I'm overthinking. Because naming it, calling it disappointment, felt too dangerous. Disappointment implied expectation. And expectation felt like asking for something he couldn't, or wouldn't, give. She noticed how often she lowered the bar. Before he even had the chance to miss it. How she forgave him. For moments that hadn't happened yet. And each time she did, a quiet lesson formed inside her. Don't hope too loudly. Don't need too clearly. Don't make him responsible for how you feel. From the outside, she looked calm. Adaptable. Easy to love. Inside, something began to tighten. Not anger. Not sadness. A careful shrinking. She started saying, "It's okay," before he apologized. Started smiling before he noticed the hurt. Started filling silences with explanations that protected him from discomfort. And the strange thing was, he seemed relieved. Relieved that she didn't ask for more. Relieved that nothing required him to step closer. That relief told her everything she didn't want to know. So she didn't name the disappointment. She buried it under understanding. Under patience. Under love that learned how to be smaller. But unspoken disappointments don't disappear. They wait. They collect. They turn into distance long before they turn into words. And that was the first one. The disappointment she didn't name. But her body remembered. For learning to ask for less. She didn't decide it all at once. There was no promise she made to herself. No rule written down. It happened gradually. The way people lower their voice in a quiet room. Without realizing they've started whispering. She learned to ask for less. By watching what made him uncomfortable. A longer pause. A tightened jaw. That subtle shift when emotion entered the room. And he didn't know where to put it. So she adjusted. She asked fewer questions. She shared fewer thoughts. She kept her feelings simple. Digestible. Manageable. When she needed reassurance, she asked for certainty instead. When she wanted closeness, she accepted routine. When she craved warmth, she settled for familiarity. She told herself it was maturity. Compromise. Love growing quieter, like it's supposed to. But there was a difference she felt and never said out loud. This wasn't two people meeting in the middle. This was one person stepping back. So the other wouldn't have to step forward. She became proud of how little she needed. How independent she looked. How easy she was to be with. Friends would say, "You two seem so stable." And she'd smile. Because stability sounded better than absence. At night, lying next to him, she rehearsed conversations she never planned to have. She edited sentences before they were spoken. She decided which feelings were worth the effort. And which ones should stay unnamed. It wasn't fear that stopped her. It was efficiency. She knew which requests would lead nowhere. She knew which truths would be met with silence. She learned the economy of emotional exchange. Give less, lose less. But something about that logic came at a cost. She began to feel lighter in a way that wasn't relief. Less present in her own life. Like she was slowly packing herself away. To make space for peace. And the quieter she became, the more comfortable he seemed. He praised her calm. Her understanding. How low maintenance she was. Those words landed strangely. Like compliments that asked her to disappear just a little more. She didn't argue. She didn't demand. She adapted. Because asking for less worked. It kept things smooth. It kept the relationship intact. But it also taught her a dangerous lesson. That love was something you earned. By not asking for too much of it. And that was when she stopped noticing. How small her voice had become. 5. Emotional unavailability. It took her a long time to realize what she was dealing with. Because it didn't look like cruelty. It looked like calm. Like maturity. Like a man who doesn't do drama. But the longer she stayed, the clearer it became. He wasn't calm. He was closed. Emotional unavailability is strange because it hides behind good behavior. He never yelled. He never cheated. He never threatened to leave. He just didn't arrive. When she spoke about her feelings, he treated them like problems to solve. Okay, so what do you want me to do? His tone was practical. Clean. Emotionless, like a checklist. And at first, she blamed herself for wanting more. For needing warmth instead of answers. Because he could be generous in visible ways. He'd pay for dinners. Fix things around the house. Remember the big dates. He knew how to show up in public. He just didn't know how to show up in private. When she cried, his eyes would go distant. He'd look at her like she was speaking a language he couldn't translate. He'd offer a tissue. A glass of water. You'll be okay. But he wouldn't move toward her with his heart. And that's the part no one talks about. How your grief can sit right between you at the table. And still be ignored, politely. Sometimes she tried to make it easier for him. She'd say, "I'm not blaming you." She'd soften her voice, shrink her need, wrap it in kindness. She'd ask for something small. "Can you just hold me for a minute?" And he would. For a minute. His arms around her, his mind somewhere else. A touch that felt like obligation, not devotion. Then he'd pull away and return to normal. Like emotional closeness was a task he completed. She began to notice patterns. When she brought up pain, he changed the subject. When she asked deeper questions, he joked. When she needed reassurance, he offered logic. And she started to understand, he didn't refuse her because he didn't care at all. He refused her because closeness made him feel exposed. It wasn't that he didn't love her. It was that love, real love, required presence. And presence required risk. And risk was the one thing he couldn't tolerate. So he kept everything safe. Controlled. Surface level. A relationship that looked fine. But felt like standing outside a locked door. Pressing your ear against it. Waiting for a voice that never comes. That's what emotional unavailability does. It makes you question your reality. Because you keep thinking, he's right here, so why'd I feel abandoned? And the answer is simple, but brutal. A body can stay. And still leave you alone. 6. The illusion of stability. From the outside, everything looked steady. That was the part that confused her the most. There were routines. Mornings that started the same way. Evenings that ended without conflict. A shared calendar, a shared bed, shared groceries. Nothing was falling apart. And because nothing was breaking, she kept telling herself nothing was wrong. Stability can be deceptive like that. It wears the shape of safety, but carries none of its warmth. People admired them. Friends used words like solid, mature, low drama. They said stability the way people say success. As if it were the goal, not the cost. She nodded along. Because how do you explain a lack? How do you say? I feel lonely in a life that's functioning perfectly. There were no arguments to point to. No betrayals to justify her unease. Just a quiet sense that she was living beside him. Not with him. They planned trips efficiently. They discussed finances calmly. They handled life like competent partners. But when it came to her inner world, her doubts, her fears, the soft places she never showed anyone else, there was no room on the schedule. Stability meant predictability. Predictability meant control. And control left no space for emotional messiness. She started to notice how often she adapted herself to maintain the appearance of fine. She didn't rock the boat. Didn't ask questions that lingered. Didn't bring feelings that might slow things down. Peace became a performance. Harmony became avoidance. And the longer it lasted, the harder it was to admit what it lacked. Because walking away from chaos makes sense. But walking away from something that looks stable? That feels irresponsible, ungrateful, dramatic. So she stayed. She told herself that love doesn't have to be intense. That passion fades. That this, quiet, reliable, undemanding, was what grown-up relationships were supposed to become. But her body told a different story. She felt heavy in moments that should have felt light. She felt tired after conversations that went nowhere. She felt relief when she was alone. And guilt for feeling it. Stability had given her structure. But it hadn't given her connection. And slowly, without realizing it, she started confusing endurance with commitment. And silence with peace. That's how the illusion works. It convinces you that because nothing is breaking, you shouldn't want more. But stability without care is just loneliness with good manners. 7. Adapting to absence. She didn't wake up one day and decide to accept less. She adjusted, quietly, instinctively. The way the body adjusts to cold when it realizes warmth isn't coming. At first, the absence felt sharp, noticeable, like a missing step on a staircase. But over time, she learned where not to step. She stopped reaching for him when something good happened. Stopped turning toward him when something hurt. She learned to process moments alone. Even when he was sitting right beside her. It wasn't resentment. It was efficiency. She began to fill the empty spaces herself. Long walks without sharing the thoughts they stirred. Late nights scrolling, reading, listening. Anything that didn't require emotional reciprocity. She told herself she was becoming stronger. More self-sufficient. Less needy. And in some ways, she was. But there's a difference between independence and learning not to expect comfort. She learned how to regulate her disappointment before it reached her face. How to swallow questions mid-sentence. How to nod when she wanted to pause. Absence became predictable. Predictability made it survivable. She adjusted her internal rhythm to match his distance. Lowered her emotional volume. Matched his minimalism with her own restraint. Friends noticed she'd grown quieter. Calmer. Centered, they said. What they didn't see was how much energy it took to stay that composed. She started to feel like a guest in her own relationship. Careful, polite, undemanding. Grateful for small gestures. Quick to dismiss her own longing. When he forgot to ask about her day, she preempted the disappointment by not mentioning it. When he missed the moment she needed him, she convinced herself it wasn't that important. She became skilled at disappearing emotionally, without physically leaving. And the strange part was, he seemed happier. Less tension. Fewer difficult conversations. More peace. Her adaptation worked. But something inside her went quiet in the process. She no longer anticipated being met. She anticipated managing alone. And that shift, that subtle rewiring of expectation, marked the moment absence stopped hurting and started shaping who she was. Not because she wanted less connection, but because she learned how to live without it. 8. Staying without being seen. There's a particular loneliness that comes from staying, not leaving, not fighting, just remaining. She stayed in the same space, the same rhythm, the same life. But something essential about her had gone unnoticed for so long. It began to feel invisible. He knew where she was. He knew what she did. He knew the outline of her days. But he didn't know her. Not the quiet questions she carried. Not the way she replayed conversations in her head, wondering if she had said too much or not enough. Not the effort it took to keep her disappointment from showing. She learned how to be present without being revealed. She listened more than she spoke. Agreed more than she disagreed. Smiled in places where honesty would have slowed things down. When he talked, she nodded. When he vented, she held space. When he withdrew, she gave him room. As if space were a language she had learned fluently. And the strange thing was, the better she became at staying unseen, the smoother everything felt. No tension. No difficult pauses. No moments that asked him to look closer. People said she was supportive. Understanding. Such a good partner. Those words sounded hollow. Because being good didn't feel like being known. It felt like being convenient. She began to notice how rarely he asked follow-up questions. How quickly conversations turned back to neutral ground. How her inner life stayed just beyond his curiosity. She could sit right next to him. Heart full of unsaid things. And he wouldn't sense the weight of it. Not because he was cruel. But because he wasn't looking. Staying without being seen does something subtle to a person. You start doubting the importance of your own experience. You start minimizing your feelings before anyone else can. You start performing, okay, so convincingly, that even you forget what you're holding back. She didn't disappear all at once. She faded in layers. First her complaints. Then her hopes. Then the parts of herself that asked for recognition. Until one day, she realized she had become easy to overlook. Even by herself. And the hardest part wasn't that he didn't see her. It was that staying had taught her how to live as if being unseen were normal. As if presence were enough. As if love didn't require witness. 9. The cost of staying. The cost of staying didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated quietly. Like interest on a debt she never agreed to take on. At first, staying felt responsible. Loyal. Like proof that she was strong enough to endure discomfort for love. But over time, the price began to show up in places she hadn't expected. She grew tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. Conversations drained her. Decisions felt heavier than they should have. Not because life was hard, but because she was carrying herself alone. She started doubting her instincts. Every time something felt wrong, she questioned whether she was being unfair. Too emotional, too sensitive, too demanding. Staying had taught her to mistrust her own reactions. She noticed how often she apologized for feelings that didn't harm anyone. How quickly she explained herself before anyone asked her to. Her inner voice grew cautious, measured, always scanning for the safest emotional position. Joy became muted. Anger became impossible. Sadness had nowhere to go. Everything was filtered through one question. Will this create distance or keep the peace? And peace always won. The cost showed up in her body too. Tight shoulders. A shallow breath she didn't notice she was holding. A constant readiness, like she was waiting for something to go wrong. Even when nothing ever did. She stopped asking herself what she wanted. Because wanting implied disappointment. And disappointment required energy she no longer had. Staying demanded a quiet trade. Connection for predictability. Expression for stability. Truth for harmony. And the more she paid, the less she recognized herself. She became reliable. Low maintenance. Emotionally efficient. But she also became smaller. Not invisible. Just contained. There were moments she caught glimpses of the cost. When she felt relief at the idea of being alone. When silence felt safer than honesty. When imagining a different life felt like a betrayal. Those moments scared her. Because they suggested that staying wasn't neutral anymore. It was changing her. She wasn't just sacrificing comfort. She was sacrificing aliveness. And the hardest realization came quietly. Without drama, staying wasn't preserving the relationship. It was slowly eroding her capacity to feel fully inside it. That was the cost. Not heartbreak. Not loss. But the gradual surrender of the parts of herself that once believed love should feel like being met. 10. When hope becomes a burden. Hope didn't disappear. It changed weight. At first, hope had felt like oxygen. Something that kept her breathing through the distance. If she stayed patient. If she stayed kind. If she stayed understanding. Maybe he would come closer. Hope told her to wait. But over time, waiting stopped feeling gentle. It started feeling heavy. Every small sign became something she had to manage. A late reply. A distracted a promise that dissolved into routine. Hope made her scan every moment for meaning. Was that warmth or habit? Was that silence or avoidance? She kept hope alive by lowering it, shrinking it, making it easier to carry. She told herself not to expect too much, not to read into things, not to need clarity. Hope taught her how to compromise with disappointment. And slowly, hope turned into pressure. Pressure to stay positive. Pressure to be patient. Pressure to believe that love would arrive. If she just held on a little longer. She realized she was working harder to believe in the relationship than he was working to be present in it. That imbalance exhausted her. Hope began to feel like a job she never clocked out of. A constant mental negotiation. A quiet promise she kept renewing. Even as the evidence thinned. She felt guilty when doubt appeared. As if questioning meant failing. As if letting go meant she hadn't tried hard enough. So she stayed hopeful. Not because hope felt good, but because giving it up felt like admitting defeat. She started carrying hope the way people carry fragile things, carefully, tensely, afraid of dropping it. And the irony was cruel. The more she hoped, the more alone she felt. Because hope kept her focused on a future that never arrived, instead of the present that was asking to be seen. She noticed how much energy it took to keep believing. How often she postponed her own needs for a version of him that existed only in possibility. Hope stopped feeling like light. It felt like responsibility. And that's when she understood something quietly devastating. Hope, when it isn't met, doesn't just hurt. It burdens. It asks you to carry tomorrow on the back of a today that never changes. 11. The moment she stopped expecting. The moment she stopped expecting didn't feel dramatic. It wasn't anger. It wasn't a breakup speech. It was quiet. Almost gentle. It happened on an ordinary night. Nothing special in the air. No warning sign. Just the familiar rhythm of their life. Steady, controlled, emotionally thin. She said something small. Not a demand. Not a fight. Just a reach. I had a hard day. She whispered, like an offering. And he answered the way he always did. Half present, practical, already moving past it. Yeah, what happened? But his eyes stayed on the screen. His body stayed angled away. His voice stayed neutral, like he was reading a line. She paused, waiting for the part where he would come closer. Waiting for warmth. Waiting for care. And when it didn't arrive, something inside her simply stopped. Not her love. Not her loyalty. Just the expecting. It was like her mind finally accepted what her body had known for months. Reaching for him here would only bruise her again. She felt a strange relief. Not happiness. Relief. Because expectation is work. It's constant hope management. It's the tension of, maybe this time. And letting it go made the room feel lighter. She didn't tell him. There was nothing to announce. No statement that would change him. No sentence that could make him suddenly present. She just adjusted her heart. The way you adjust a hand after touching something hot. She said, "It's fine." And this time she meant it differently. Fine didn't mean okay. Fine meant, I won't ask again. She watched him nod, satisfied. He believed the problem was solved. And she realized the cruelest part. This wasn't a moment he would remember. For him, nothing changed. For her, everything did. Because when you stop expecting, you stop being surprised. You stop being wounded by the same absence. You stop handing someone the power to disappoint you in the exact same place. That night, she lay beside him, staring into the dark. And she felt the space between them like an ocean. But she didn't try to cross it. She didn't bargain with reality. She didn't tell herself stories. She simply let the truth settle. He could stay forever. And still never meet her. And in that quiet acceptance, she felt the beginning of a different kind of strength. The kind that doesn't beg to be seen. 12. Naming the truth. Naming the truth didn't come with clarity at first. It came with resistance. Because once you name something, you can't pretend it's temporary anymore. For a long time, she had used softer words. Distance. Miscommunication. Different love languages. Those words felt polite. They left room for hope. They suggested effort might fix it. But one night, sitting alone in the quiet she had grown used to, the truth surfaced without decoration. This wasn't distance. It was abandonment. Not the kind where someone leaves, but the kind where someone stays and never fully arrives. Saying it to herself felt sharp, almost cruel. Because abandonment carries weight. It admits harm. It admits loss. And it meant accepting something she had avoided for too long. She wasn't asking for too much. She was asking the wrong person. She replayed the years in her mind. Not with blame, but with honesty. The way her needs had been minimized. The way her feelings were treated like inconveniences. The way she learned to translate loneliness into patience. Naming the truth rearranged the story. It wasn't that she failed to communicate. It was that he failed to engage. It wasn't that she was too emotional. It was that he was unavailable. And once those words formed clearly, something loosened inside her chest. Because the truth didn't accuse her. It released her. She no longer had to keep proving that her pain was valid. No longer had to explain why being unseen hurts. No longer had to negotiate reality. Abandonment explained the exhaustion, the self-doubt, the quiet grief she carried without permission. It gave her language for what her body already knew. And language is powerful. It turns confusion into understanding. It turns shame into clarity. She noticed how her posture changed. Once she stopped blaming herself. How her breath deepened. How the constant question, "What's wrong with me?" finally went quiet. Naming the truth didn't fix the relationship. It didn't change him. But it changed where she stood. She was no longer waiting to be chosen. No longer hoping to be seen through effort. She was standing in truth. And truth doesn't beg. 13. What hurt more than love? What hurt more than love wasn't losing him. It was losing herself while staying. Love, at least, announces its absence. It leaves a shape you can grieve. A door you can point to and say, "This is where it ended." But what she felt didn't have an ending. It had erosion. It was the slow wearing down of her inner voice. The quiet trade she made, day after day. Choosing harmony over honesty. Peace over presence. She realized that the deepest wound wasn't that he couldn't meet her. It was that she learned to stop meeting herself. She used to know what she felt the moment she felt it. Now she hesitated, questioned, softened it before it could be dismissed by someone else. She learned to preempt rejection. By rejecting parts of herself first. That hurt more than love. Because love can fail you once. But self-abandonment happens every day you stay silent. She remembered moments when she laughed and didn't recognize the sound. Moments when she agreed and felt something inside her flinch. She wasn't heartbroken. She was disconnected from her needs, her instincts, her truth. And no one had asked her to do that. There was no ultimatum, no demand. She did it to survive the gap between them. That's the cruelty of emotional absence. It doesn't force you to leave. It teaches you how to disappear politely. What hurt more than love was realizing how much life she postponed. Waiting to be met. The trips she didn't suggest. The dreams she didn't say out loud. The parts of herself she kept for later. As if later were guaranteed. She mourned the version of herself who believed love meant expansion. Who thought being chosen would feel like being seen. Instead, she learned how to stay small. Without making anyone uncomfortable. And that loss didn't come with tears. It came with numbness. With a strange calm that felt like acceptance. But tasted like resignation. Love didn't wound her this deeply. Staying did. Because staying required her to bend. Until she no longer recognized the shape of her own wanting. And when she finally understood that, the pain sharpened, not into despair, but into clarity. She could forgive him for what he couldn't give. But forgiving herself for all she gave away. Without being asked. That was harder. That was what hurt more than love. 14. Letting go without drama. Letting go didn't look like a storm. It looked like a deep exhale. No slammed doors. No screaming. No final speech that made him suddenly understand. Because she wasn't trying to punish him. She wasn't trying to win. She was trying to stop bleeding quietly. For a long time she believed leaving had to be justified by something visible. A betrayal. A fight. A clear villain. But this wasn't that kind of story. This was the kind where nothing bad enough happens, and you still slowly disappear. So she chose a different kind of ending. Not dramatic. Just honest. She didn't say, "You ruined me." She didn't list his mistakes like evidence in court. She said the truth in a voice so calm it almost surprised her. "I can't keep living like this." That sentence held everything. It held the nights she cried silently. The mornings she woke up tired of hoping. The years she edited herself to fit into his comfort. She noticed how he reacted. Not with cruelty. But with confusion. "But I'm here," he said. Like presence was a receipt he could hand her. And she understood then. He truly believed staying meant caring. So she didn't argue. She didn't beg him to feel what he couldn't feel. She didn't demand emotional language from a man who only spoke in logistics. She simply repeated herself, gently, "I know you're here. But I've been alone anyway." That was the whole tragedy. And the whole release. Letting go without drama means letting go of the fantasy too. The fantasy that one perfect conversation will change everything. The fantasy that if you explain it differently, they'll suddenly arrive. She stopped explaining. Not because she didn't have words. But because she finally respected reality. She packed slowly. Not just her things. Her expectations. She let go of the version of him she had been loving in her head. The future she kept saving for. The warmth she kept hoping he'd learn. And in that quiet process, something softened in her. She didn't hate him. She didn't need to. She just stopped sacrificing herself to keep the peace. There's a grief in leaving this way. Because no one claps for quiet endings. No one recognizes the courage it takes. To walk away from something that looks fine. But she knew. She knew she was choosing life over waiting. Truth over habit. Her own voice over silence. And that was enough. 15. Quiet healing. Healing didn't arrive as a breakthrough. There was no moment where she suddenly felt whole again. It came quietly. In fragments. In the absence of urgency. At first, the quiet felt unfamiliar. Almost dangerous. Without the constant effort of managing someone else's distance. She didn't know where to place her attention. So she placed it on herself. Carefully. Without expectations. She started noticing small things again. How her body felt in the morning. What emotions passed through her before she explained them away. How much space her own thoughts needed. There was grief, yes. But it no longer rushed her. It sat beside her. Like something that didn't need fixing. She stopped rehearsing conversations in her head. Stopped preparing responses for questions no one was asking. Stopped scanning rooms for emotional temperature. That alone felt like rest. Healing didn't mean forgetting him. It meant remembering herself. She learned how to sit with discomfort, without turning it into a problem to solve. How to feel sadness, without translating it into blame. There were days she felt strong. There were days she felt empty. And for the first time, both felt allowed. She wasn't performing resilience anymore. She was practicing honesty. Quiet healing looks like drinking water when you're thirsty. Not because someone told you to, but because your body asked. It looks like saying no without explanation. Like choosing rest over proving you're okay. Like letting silence be silence. Not a gap that needs to be filled. She noticed how her nervous system softened. How her breath slowed. How her shoulders dropped without permission. These weren't dramatic changes. They were real ones. Healing didn't give her answers about the past. It gave her permission in the present. Permission to want again, slowly. Permission to trust herself, carefully. Permission to believe that connection shouldn't require disappearance. She wasn't rushing toward joy. She was rebuilding safety. And in that safety, something gentle began to return. Not excitement. Not certainty. Just a quiet sense of being back inside her own life. 16. Release. Release didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived with permission. Permission to stop explaining. Permission to stop proving. Permission to stop carrying what was never hers to carry. She didn't wake up suddenly free. Freedom came the moment she stopped arguing with reality. He was who he was. She was who she was becoming. And the space between those truths no longer needed to be bridged. Release meant she could finally put down the questions that kept her awake. Why wasn't I enough? What else could I have done? When would he finally see me? Those questions lost their power when she realized they were built on a false premise. She was never unseen because she lacked value. She was unseen because he lacked capacity. And that understanding loosened the last knot in her chest. Release looked like ordinary days done differently. Morning light without anxiety. Evenings without rehearsing conversations. Silence that felt spacious, not threatening. She no longer measured herself against someone else's limits. No longer waited for permission to feel alive. She could miss him without returning. Remember without reopening. Love without abandoning herself. Release didn't erase the past. It reframed it. What once felt like failure now looked like endurance. What once felt like loss now felt like a boundary finally honored. She carried the lessons gently. Not as warnings, but as wisdom. And perhaps the most powerful part of release was this. She no longer needed closure from him. She had created it within herself. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever stayed too long, loved too quietly, or learned to disappear just to keep the peace, please take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who might need it. And leave a comment with what part of this story stayed with you. And if you want more stories about emotional truth, quiet healing, and the courage it takes to choose yourself, subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast. This space is for the feelings we don't always have words for, until we finally let them go.